Story 1. Are you coming upstairs? The 1980s, the wonderful years of my early childhood, filled with the delicious smells of Christmas, baked apples, and amazing memories of endless, warm summer days filled with laughter and innocent, childish friendship. It was also, however, the end of this decade that marked the beginning of the end of my unblemished view of the world and thrust upon me the realization that sometimes in life we encounter eerie situations that we just cannot explain. I grew up in a city in the Midlands of England called Stoke-upon-Trent. My mother had grown up in a town on the outskirts of the city called Exeter. I recall countless happy visits to this town to see family and friends. However, it was during one of these visits that the first incident that really made me question my views on reality occurred. It was the summer of 1989, and I was 9 years old. My family was visiting an old childhood friend of my mother. I was very excited to be there because these people had a daughter named Ellie, who was my own age, and it meant that I would not be subjected to the endless whining of my irritating 6-year-old brother alone. There was to be a dinner party late in the afternoon, after which my family would be leaving me there overnight for a sleepover. I felt special because my brother was going to be going home with my parents, and I would be having all the fun. The other guests had not arrived, and dinner was quite a while from being ready. Not wanting children underfoot while the food preparation was taking place, Allie, my younger brother, her even younger brother, and I were unceremoniously foisted outside into the back garden to play until it was time to go inside to wash our hands and eat. Allie lived in a cul-de-sac, the end house of which backed onto Exeter Racecourse. Behind Allie's house, running the entire length of the short street, was a huge plot of land containing an old, condemned house that had suffered some fire damage many years earlier. Rumors were rife in the late 80s about the fate of the house. There were rumors about arson due to drug debts, rumors that the house had been home to a sex offender and his family who had fallen prey to a vigilante-style attack, even rumors that one of the occupants had committed murder and that somebody had decided that it was high time that this person get what they deserved. All anyone knew for sure was the fact that in one upstairs bedroom, the very certainly innocent young people had suddenly succumbed to smoke inhalation. Surrounding the house was a huge, overgrown orchard, and surrounding the grounds themselves was a high wall. The entrance gate, equally high and locked with a gigantic rusty padlock, was situated right at the other side of the grounds, far away from Allie's house. As young children, blissfully unaware of the desolate history of the house, Allie, our brothers, and I had spent many delightful hours with our parents, slipping through a gap in the hedge at the bottom of their garden, and walking the grounds to pick apples, pears, and blackberries with which we could make fruit crumble when we returned home. On this particular day, as Allie and I sat restlessly at the bottom of the garden bored to tears after having played with all the outdoor toys and having spent at least 10 minutes petting her rabbit, our eyes met, and she glanced and nodded at the hole in the hedge, knowing full well that we were not supposed to enter the orchard without permission, and stealing a stealthy glance up towards our brothers playing with their boring bows toys up by the back door, we surreptitiously slipped through the hedge into the woods beyond. We felt absolutely no fear, for the orchard was our playground of old. We fantasized about fairies and magical beings as we clambered around through the undergrowth, dropping apples from the trees into the front of our outstretched jumpers. Maybe if we told our parents that we only ventured a little way in, they would disregard our disobedience and allow us to make apple crumble after dinner. Suddenly, and seemingly with no warning, we realized that the old derelict house was directly in front of us. You could tell from the outside that the place had once been truly magnificent. 2 stories high, built of gray stone, the house inspired our 9-year-old selves to romanticize about beautiful princesses trapped in ivy-covered towers. It was sad to see the soot-licked, empty downstairs window frames that were still home to shards of jagged broken glass, and the weed-ravaged front door that had long since fallen from its hinges and began to decay upon the moss-covered ground. The upstairs windows were boarded up, presumably less accessible to vandals, and the roof looked patchy as if the slate-gray tiles could fall at any given moment. We stared up in awe. I confessed that I was again thinking of handsome princes charging through the orchard, sword in hand, ready to bestow true love's kiss. Allie, being a sixer in one of the local church's brownie groups, and also being heavily involved in a lot of out-of-school sporting activities, was much cockier than I and of an extremely curious nature. She quickly stated that we absolutely must go inside to explore. Hesitant for merely a second, I agreed, and we marched bravely forward, tearing in through the dilapidated door frame. Directly in front of us we could see a long hallway with a large, fairly well-lit room to the left. Gazing farther down the hall, we saw several more doors that led off to the left, and what appeared to be the kitchen at the end, but it was hard to tell as the hallway really did seem very long, more like a corridor. There was a wide staircase to the right that obscured any possible doors on that side of the hall. Looking up the staircase, I felt my first faint twinge of unease. Due to the boarded-up windows on the upper level, it was difficult to see very far up the staircase at all. In fact, of course, this must be due to my childish imagination. The stairs seemed to be swallowed just over halfway up by an unnatural, eerie darkness, seeming not to notice that huge, gaping mouth of a staircase, and grabbing my hand, Allie pulled me into the large room to our left. It had obviously once been a sitting room, defaced by graffiti. There was a good amount of soot-damaged, flowery paper peeling off the walls. There were even some old and extremely dingy-looking armchairs that had certainly seen better days. Forgetting all about the staircase, I squatted down by the fireplace, beckoning Allie to follow, and we allowed our apples to fall onto the cracked hearth. Light magically dappled from the canopy of trees above us, streamed through the empty window frame. It seemed enchanted, almost as if real fairies might actually live here. We sat and chatted for quite a while, giggling with our childish innocence about a trick that we meant to play on her brother that night. She had a set of walkie-talkies, and we planned to leave one under his bed and whisper into it as he was falling asleep to basically scare the pants off him. In hindsight, this seems very cruel, but at the time we genuinely believed that it was terribly funny. I bit into an apple and we toyed with the idea of visiting the other rooms on the ground floor level. We both agreed that we would not be going upstairs, as even at such a young age we had the sense to be aware that the staircase was almost definitely unstable after the fire, and we did not want to risk it, knowing that our parents would be furious if anything happened. It then occurred to me, however, that she may have noticed the unnatural darkness and silence of the staircase as we entered the house, and felt no desire to go poking around in places that certainly did not appear to be very welcoming. As we sat and pondered, a sound became apparent, asterisk, tap, 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 asterisk, very softly, followed by what sounded like a soft, scratching noise. It seemed to come from the outside of the window frame of the room that we were sitting in. We froze, our heads whipping round to stare at the empty hole. We stayed that way for what seemed like 10 minutes, but what must have realistically only been a few seconds. Upon hearing nothing else, Allie giggled, which unnerved me. After all, they may have heard her, but then I ticked myself off for being such a baby. However, it did hit me how silly we had been to sneak off into the orchard with no one knowing that we had even left the garden. There were no more sounds. Toll was suddenly very quiet. "Did you hear that?" I hissed. Allie shrugged, stating that she believed it was probably one of the neighbor's cats, or even just the wind blowing a tree branch against the empty window frame. Nevertheless, to me our sanctuary was now slightly tainted. We stowed our fruit back into our jumpers. She took my hand, and we stood up and made for the doorway so we could explore further. Upon exiting the room, Allie and I had a better view of the hallway. There were in fact just 2 more doors on the left-hand side. They both appeared to be ajar, however. The lighting was far from wonderful. We would not be able to see inside without venturing forth. I remember feeling that the place seemed extremely creepy. I just felt a kind of unsettling unease. I voiced my opinions to Allie about not wanting to continue our explorations, but she laughed and told me that I was being silly. Pushing my fears aside and again chastising myself for being such a baby, I followed Allie into the next room. Once inside, I relaxed a little. Again, the glass in the window was broken, but the frame was large and the room well lit. It appeared to have once been very pretty indeed. In its heyday, I am positive that it had been a very grand dining room. Most of the furniture appeared to be pretty much still in place, including a large wooden sideboard. No bone china remained, of course, for the house would have been looted years ago by thieves, but there was much less graffiti than there had been in the first room. This room, however, was a considerable amount dingier and more damaged than the previous room. Touching the rotting remains of a large wooden table, I was able to draw a face in the soot. Allie bounded about opening drawers and chattering endlessly about who might have lived here. They absolutely must have been very posh, as the furniture was all very beautiful, or it had been at one point anyway. As Allie explored, I moved over to the sideboard to examine the pretty design that had been chiseled into the wood. As a child, I loved anything intricate. It always seemed to draw me in. It was at this point that I became aware of what sounded like soft but quick footsteps directly above the place that I was standing. I said nothing and listened for a minute, feeling my skin start to break out in goosebumps. The steps seemed to be scuttling back and forth. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and stop. And again and again. "Allie, do you hear that?" I whispered, nodding at the ceiling above. Allie's movements slowed to a halt, and she looked up. Following my eyes to the ceiling, silence. The sound was gone as suddenly as it started. Yet again, Allie giggled at me and told me that I was a wimp and that I should be braver. Upon finishing her inspection on the room, Allie insisted that we needed to explore the third room on the corridor. Then we could go, as I was obviously too much of a baby to continue. Was she seriously not feeling the sense of dread that was now firmly lodged in the pit of my stomach? How on earth could she be so pleased about the fact that we were in the middle of a creaky, abandoned house in the middle of an orchard, and that nobody else knew where we were? Allie placed one hand on the door of the third room, making sure not to drop her carefully gathered apples, and push gently. The door swung open, and we both gasped, me in horror, and she, I suspect, in awe. This was obviously the room in which the fire had raged at its worst. It was a much smaller room than the other two, and the window was extremely tiny, hardly allowing any light at all. The walls appeared to be almost totally black from grime. There was no furniture to be seen. The wall parallel to the kitchen had been entirely burnt through, and we could see the outlines of the blackened remnants of kitchen units hanging like long dead prisoners manacled in some hellish dungeon. A dripping nose gained our attention. We looked to the source and noted a dirty gray puddle lying against the same burnt wall and leaking through into the kitchen. Looking up, we saw a sizable hole burnt into the ceiling, appearing as emptily black and uninviting as the staircase. This was the source of the fluid, and I knew then that I had had enough. "This place is horrible," I hissed at Allie. All fantasies of fairies and princesses had long disappeared and been replaced with an unpleasant disquiet. This was no palace. It was a place where bad things happened. I had become certain of that, and I wanted to leave. Allie looked at me and sighed. "Okay," and we turned to face the open doorway that lay at the end of the hall, as open and inviting as any ice cream parlor or toy shop. This was when things started to take a turn towards the inexplicable. We took several steps towards the door and we froze. Remember back in the day those toys called space hoppers? They looked like giant, heavy-duty balloons with large ears that you held on to so you could sit on and bounce around. Well, Allie owned one. It was bright pink and had the face of a goofy bunny rabbit painted on the front. And it was there, out in the hallway near the base of the stairs, facing us. I remember that I felt physically sick. I had been correct. Someone was there, but who on earth could it be? Oh, how silly we had been to just disappear like this. Had our brothers seen us sneaking off into the orchard and decided to play a joke on us similar to the one that we planned on playing on Allie's brother that night? I stood frozen to the spot, not wanting to venture any further along the corridor and confront whatever must be lurking there waiting for us. "Come on," Allie whispered. There was no other way out. I didn't fancy my chances with either of the empty window frames in the first two rooms, which still housed shards of broken glass. If I ripped my skirt, my mother would be furious. I felt sick to my stomach as we slowly took several steps forward, more of the hallway coming into view, revealing the wide, open mouth of the staircase. Suddenly, Allie was jumping up and down and howling with laughter. She grabbed my hand and pulled me onward. I looked up and felt an immediate sense of relief. There, standing on the first step of the staircase, was Allie's friend, Evangeline. I had completely forgotten that her family had been invited to the dinner party. A year older than us, Evangeline lived in the road parallel to Allie's, the road that boasted the entrance to Exeter Racecourse, where a lot of well-to-do rich people lived. Evangeline was by character extremely bossy and horsey, a direct result of having grown up privileged. Upon our questioning of what she was doing there and did she see us sneak in, Evangeline smiled at us with that wide, cheeky grin that we knew so well, and she pointed up the stairs. "Come upstairs," she giggled in her distinct, rather posh voice. Evangeline's father was the managing director of a company several cities away, and she attended boarding school during term time and always returned for the holidays extremely well spoken. "I have been exploring up there, and I've found something that I really want to show you." With that, she turned her back to us and bounded up several stairs. Allie, of course, moved forward immediately, but gazing up into the pitch darkness and remembering the dripping black hole of the third room, something inside made me grab her wrist. Without turning back around to look at us, Evangeline spoke again. "Come on," she urged. "You really need to see what I found up here." At this point, she was no longer bounding up the steps. She was walking very slowly, one stair at a time, lifting one foot then the other without looking back. It almost looked as if time had slowed down. I found this odd, and again a nagging feeling of disquiet gnawed at my stomach. What on earth could she have possibly been able to find in that pitch blackness? And, quite honestly, what had she been doing up there all alone in the dark in the first place? It was the last place any well-behaved little girl should be. Evangeline took another step towards the darkness and stopped. "Are you coming?" she asked. This time her voice seemed laced with what sounded like an irritable, maybe even demanding tone. However, despite her obvious irritation, she didn't turn around, and her arms hung down limply by her sides. Again, Allie made a move forward. This time, when I grabbed her, I yanked her back hard, and she turned her large green eyes on me in surprise. I looked up at Evangeline as she took another step into the ever-increasing darkness, and then something struck me. Evangeline was a girly girl. Allie, and I often compared clothes. Remember in the 1980s, those awful layered rah-rah skirts with matching frilly T-shirts or jumpers? Well, Evangeline would never be seen without one of those outfits on, yet the girl in front of us was wearing what appeared to be cut off, mid-calf length dark blue jeans and a gray sweatshirt. As I watched her climb, almost swallowed now by the unrelenting nothingness, it was then that I noticed something else. It had to be a trick of the eye, surely. As the gloom closed in on her, her arms seemed to be growing longer and longer as they continued to hang limply by her sides. I looked across at Allie again and noticed that she was staring at Evangeline, and her eyes were now narrow and confused, as if for the first time she was getting some inkling that something may indeed be amiss. I tried to take a step backwards, but for the first time ever in my life I was paralyzed with what must be irrational fear. It had to be the eeriness of the house coupled with the odd behavior of our friend, causing me to imagine things. Barely visible now, Evangeline finally stopped her slow, deliberate steps and turned around. She was nothing but a dark silhouette. Again we heard her speak. This time we heard it in a whisper, but it seemed to me like the sound was inside our very heads. "Are you coming to see what I've found, or will I need to come and fetch you?" As she spoke the last few words, she reached out her arms towards us, and I kid you not, those arms looked like tentacles in the darkness. Black, almost fluid-like, her arms appeared to snake through the air down the stairs towards us. This broke the spell. Allie and I both suddenly found our feet, turned our backs on the thing on the staircase, and shot out of the front door, forgetting our plans to make fruit crumble The apples tumbled from our jumpers. We stumbled madly through the undergrowth, finally bursting through the hole in the hedge, our hearts thundering and both of us sweating like pigs on a spit. Our brothers looked on in amusement at our disheveled appearance. What on earth had just happened, I wondered. What on earth had Evangeline been playing at scaring us like that? By this point, back in the safety of the garden, meaning back in our comfort zone, he briefly talked and convinced ourselves that the eerie nature of the upstairs of the house had caused our minds to play tricks on us. I even began to feel somewhat guilty for leaving our friend behind in that scary place. Looking at each other, we stumbled up the garden path to the back door, both still rather shaken and desperate for a drink of water, after which we were planning to try to convince our brothers to break the rules and accompany us back into the orchard to try to see if we could find Evangeline and bring her back with us. The back door to Allie's house opens to the kitchen, which leads to a hallway that runs the entire length of the rather small house, ending directly at the front door. We both had a quick drink of water, gazing out into the hallway as we did so. A knock at the front door caught our attention. We automatically walked forward to see Allie's mother answer the door for Evangeline's mother, who was clutching a bottle of what looked like wine. She was apologizing for being later than she expected and explaining how her car had failed to start after she had visited the bank in town, and it had set her back half an hour. As she was ushered into the living room by Allie's mother, our jaws dropped in terrified, gut-wrenching horror as she moved to the side to reveal Evangeline behind her, hair braided neatly, wearing a pink and white skirt and T-shirt set, and clutching a fluffy pink rucksack. Allie and I gaped in horrified amazement, and Evangeline stared back with a puzzled look on her face. Had we imagined our encounter in the abandoned house? Had it been someone else? Oh, the way children rationalize everything. We did, after all, still believe in fairies. It must have been another girl, but we had been so sure that it had been her. Finally, the puzzled look evaporated from Evangeline's face, and she smiled at us, then moaned with that sense of entitlement that she always exuded that her day had been really boring so far, and could we please go up to Allie's room to play with her My Little Ponies for a while before dinner began. She passed her partially open rucksack to Allie for her to hang it up on the pegs at the foot of the stairs. Allie glanced down at the bag and her face went white. I looked from Allie to Evangeline, wondering what on earth was wrong now. Still smiling, Evangeline, now standing on the bottom step of the flight of stairs, looked directly at me and simply said, "Silly, silly, silly," as Allie dropped the rucksack in revulsion, spilling its fruity contents out onto the hall floor. "You left behind your apples," Evangeline continued, her eyes glinting wickedly. "How were you ever going to be able to make crumble without them? Now, are you both coming upstairs, needless to say, in favor of the adult-filled safety of the living room?" We declined. Story 2. Visions in the Fog. Cliff was finally upon the small Louisiana town of Crescent Falls that he had sought out. It was an unassuming, run-down town that normally wouldn't attract anyone. But Cliff was not just passing through, and he wasn't your average traveler. Cliff had a penchant for seeking out urban legends and myths, and he felt he had hit the jackpot. It was such a compelling legend that Cliff had decided to drive to Louisiana from his home in Arkansas. Cliff had gone to several so-called haunted locations with little to show for them. He always managed to capture some odd image or sound on his camcorder, but it was nothing of any significance. Cliff hoped he would find something worthwhile this time. He had stumbled upon the legend of a bog dubbed by the locals Suicide Bog several months ago. After further researching the topic, he decided it had some credibility, enough to warrant a trip. He had read tales of ghostly figures, eerie whispers, and past deaths in the bog, which had been both hallowed and feared by the local Native Americans. The townspeople of Crescent Falls had set their eyes upon the woods for various reasons, which culminated in a horrific massacre of 7 loggers in 1923. Since then, several more mysterious disappearances had been linked to the place. Cliff was now in sight of his intended first stop, the town's warehouse. He had already arranged to meet with a contact he had met online, who told Cliff he would get him in touch with a local man who had extensive knowledge of the bog's history. The warehouse was as derelict as the rest of the town. Cliff barked at the warehouse and was immediately accosted by a middle-aged man standing outside the warehouse. "Are you Cliff?" the man asked. "Yes," Cliff responded. The man motioned for Cliff to follow as he entered the warehouse. Men worked as the two walked through the warehouse and up a flight of stairs to the foreman's office. The man knocked. After a few seconds, the door opened to reveal a decrepit old man. "Cliff, this Everett. He'll tell you all you want to know. I have to get back to work now," the man said as he briskly walked back into the warehouse. Cliff took a seat as Everett lit a cigarette and sat back in his chair. "So you want to know about the old Suicide Bog?" Everett wheezed out. It was clear his lungs were bad. "Yes, please, I'm very interested in this legend." Cliff replied, "I guess you are if you drove all the way from Arkansas. And it ain't no legend, it's very real," Everett responded. Cliff merely nodded and took out his notebook, ready to jot down what Everett told him. Everett muttered under his breath about Cliff not believing him before beginning his narrative. In between coughs, he began about the bog's use as a place for rituals and burials by the Native Americans. The local Indians used the bog for rites of passage. Everett began, it was a spiritual place. However, eventually the tribesmen began to feel the presence of a malevolent being. They ceased to enter the bog. They felt it was no longer their place to go and left it alone. "What sort of being?" Cliff asked. "I'm getting to that," Everett said as he took a drag on his cigarette. Avoiding the place wasn't enough to keep the being, who would later be known to the tribe as the Mother of the Bog, at bay. The whispers and voices could be heard. The closer you got to the bog and the foggier it was, the more powerful and compelling the voices were. That must be related to the disappearances and the murders in 1923. Cliff said as he wrote down several notes. Everett nodded. Yes, the voices demanded sacrifice to be fed flesh, blood, and sinew. Some were able to resist the commands, others were not. Over the years, many tribesmen under the influence of the voices and wandered into the bog. They were never seen again. Cliff eyed Everett intently as his interest in the story grew. It was all bullshit. It had to be. But it still succeeded in sending a chill down his spine. After a few years, Everett continued, the tribe reached an agreement with the Mother of the Bog. They would leave their dead in the bog as long as the voices stopped luring their people to their demise. The deal worked, at least until the tribe was displaced. The settlers who moved here did not bury their dead in the bog, and the voices gradually grew stronger. There were a few disappearances here and there, but people picked up and left frequently, so nothing was really thought of it. Until 1923. The murders happened then, Cliff stated. Yep, Everett stated. A group of 10 loggers began working in the bog and surrounding woodlands. My grandfather was the only one of the 10 to come out unscathed. Cliff's interest reached new heights as he heard this. The 10 of them were creeped out from the start. Something wasn't right, and they knew it. Everett said. The men spoke of their concerns, but their concerns were not heeded. It grew hard for the men to keep track of reality. But one logger in particular grew increasingly disturbed. What happened? How did your grandfather manage to survive all of this? Cliff asked as he continued to write in his notebook. Christopher Ross was the logger who grew disturbed. One night he began chasing a figure that only he saw. He described the figure as a hazy, otherworldly woman. Immediately after that he began speaking of feeding the mother of the bog. He started bloodletting every night, to the alarm of the other men. Every night, while muttering about feeding the mother, Christopher would cut the palms of his hands and watch the blood drip into a nearby stream. Jesus, Cliff stated. Christopher was still a reliable worker, so the men neglected to do anything other than cease any interaction with him that wasn't necessary. Christopher's mutilation reached new heights after a few days, though, Everett said. Just days before the massacre, Christopher cut off his ears and nose. He threw them into the stream as a sacrifice to the mother. He was about to cut off his lips as well when he was stopped by the other loggers. Cliff was shocked. He had not heard such a disturbing account of the place online. He was beginning to have second thoughts about visiting the bog. I never heard of such a graphic account, Cliff said. All I heard of was ghostly figures and sounds. It gets worse, Everett said grimly. Christopher was restrained and taken back into town. He screamed angrily at them for interfering with his feeding of the mother. He was committed to a psychiatric facility. His delusions and self-harm stopped shortly after he left, but he maintained that the voices and hazy being were real. He was never released. He died in the mental hospital some 20 years later. I'm guessing the murders happened next. Cliff said. Yes, my grandfather was lucky. His wife, my grandmother, was pregnant with my father at the time. A day or two before the massacre, my grandfather came into town to be present when his wife gave birth. He was in town for 3 days. He returned to the loggers' camp to find it a bloody mess. 7 of the loggers were horribly dismembered. None of them were completely recovered. Many of them had lost body parts that went unaccounted for. Some of the injuries were self-inflicted, others weren't. The 8th logger, Jacob Bishop, was gone. They never found a trace of him. Some people think he killed the other 7. And others think he too was a victim. My grandfather was sure that whatever Christopher saw killed the others. He was also sure that Bishop also fell victim to the attacker. My God. But wasn't there another incident in the bog after that? Cliff asked. Everett nodded as he coughed several times, lighting a cigarette off the end of the old one. He continued. 56 years ago, and 32 years after the massacre, the daughter of the town's sheriff disappeared in 1955. I was 10 years old then. I remember it well. She had been playing near the bog when she heard the voices. At first her parents thought she had an imaginary friend, but it soon became clear something was wrong. She began acting strangely and had cuts on her arms. Before her parents could get help, she wandered off, presumably into the bog. I'm guessing no one saw her again. Cliff said, "Right," Everett replied. "She probably met the same fate as the others who disappeared, whatever that may be." The sheriff became increasingly disturbed after she was gone. He began sitting by the stream in the bog, nearly catatonic. He would only give brief, terse answers. He believed he could hear her voice, and that she would return to him if he waited. Maybe he did hear her voice in the fog. Maybe that damned thing out there is capable of that kind of manipulation. Everett mused. "What happened to him?" Cliff asked. "He stopped taking care of himself. He basically stopped eating or maintaining himself. He was terribly pale and underweight by the time he killed himself. He left a note saying that the voice had told him that only by feeding the bog could he see his daughter again. He drowned himself in the stream." Everett stated, "His case sounds similar to one supposed ghost I read about the bog." Cliff said, "It is. A few people have reported such encounters. My grandfather, my father, and I all came to believe that the soul of anyone who died or was laid to rest in the bog was claimed by it. We've only had 2 disappearances since then, as most people know to avoid the place. We can't even be sure those who fell victim to the bog. On foggier nights the voices can be heard in town still. I think that thing uses the fog as its way of communicating with us." Everett finished. "That was quite a lot of information. Thank you for your time," Cliff said as he went to leave. "You aren't going to go check out the bog now, are you?" Everett asked. He had a worried look on his face. "No." Cliff lied. "I'm serious, Cliff. Don't go, you'll just be another disappearance. Mike, the man who showed you in, told me about you. The bog is way out of your league. Everett warned I won't go." "Thanks for your help," Cliff said. It was a lie, of course. He hadn't come all the way down just to interview one man. He was going to try to document the bog. Cliff made his way through the warehouse and out to his van. Cliff entered his van and began going through the equipment he had brought. In addition to his camcorder, Cliff had packed a field recorder to capture sounds, a flashlight, a GPS, and a large pack of batteries. He had a mattress in the back of the van so he could sleep without paying for lodging. Ignoring any hesitation that still remained, Cliff drove out to the road nearest to the bog. It wasn't a long drive, and he had already looked up the route. The road was worn and in need of work, with the wilderness slowly but surely reclaiming the space. In a few minutes, the roadside was more spacious as Cliff came upon a clear area with a clear entry point to the bog. Just up ahead was a small bridge which passed over a slow-moving stream. After taking in his surroundings, Cliff entered the tree line and made his way into the wilderness. Tonight, he would simply set up his sound recording equipment as a sort of reconnaissance in hopes of recording the alleged whispers. Tomorrow, he would actually explore the bog at night. Apart from the occasional bird, the bog was deathly silent. The vegetation was thick and impassable in many places. Many of trees, old and overgrown with other plants, hung eerily low. Cliff could hear the stream still, but he could not see it from where he was at. After walking for about 30 minutes, Cliff came upon some wetlands. Deciding this was a good place, Cliff went about setting up his recording gear and went back to his van. It was almost dark by now, so Cliff decided to settle down on the mattress in his van. It was very quiet and peaceful as Cliff laid on the mattress, nearly asleep. He was about to drift off when he heard a voice. He was unable to understand a single word, but it sounded as if a heated conversation was taking place in the woods mere feet from his van. As he strained to listen, he could barely make out the words "among us" and "mother." Suddenly, more voices from the other direction could be heard. These voices were much more calm, but still unintelligible. Growing increasingly unnerved, Cliff realized these voices sounded as if they were right outside his van. Unsure of what to do, Cliff laid there in a sweat, hoping the voices would go away. To his relief, the voices eventually subsided. However, Cliff could still hear voices in the distance every so often as he struggled to sleep. Cliff rose early and wasted no time fetching his recording equipment. He couldn't help but think he was being watched as he ventured into the bog and retrieved his equipment. Listening to the recordings, it was initially nothing more than typical wilderness sounds that began to change as voices, harsh and menacing, could be heard with increasing intensity. Much of it was unintelligible whispering, but it was without a doubt highly discomforting. Cliff thought about calling quits. This was more than enough to call it a successful trip. However, Cliff wanted more. He wanted to physically explore the bog at night. Cliff spent the hours idly waiting until the sun began to set. He set out into the bog with his camcorder, GPS, flashlight, and batteries. The bog was even more surreal and creepy at night, with the dying trees and thick vegetation casting menacing shadows. As nightfall came, Cliff noticed fog appearing at his feet. Worried he may trip, he began walking much more carefully. The first hour or so was uneventful, although unnerving. As Cliff stepped over a fallen tree, he saw movement out of the corner of his eye. Snap out of it, Cliff told himself. His eyes were playing tricks. They had to be. The sound of the stream was getting stronger. Cliff decided to approach it to see what sights the stream could offer. Keeping his camcorder up, he managed to get through a thick patch of brush. Cliff stopped dead in his tracks. Up ahead in the distance was a dark, hazy humanoid figure. Cliff's heart skipped a beat, but just as quickly as he saw it, it disappeared. "Come on, Cliff. Get a grip on yourself," Cliff muttered. Cliff was really starting to get freaked out. Every shadow made him do a double take. He mistook objects, such as stumps, for people, as if he wasn't scared enough already. He could swear the whispers were back. All around him, low to ground, Cliff could hear garbled voices of varying volume. However, every time Cliff shined his light or otherwise checked where the voices should be coming from, he found nothing. Every rational thought in Cliff's head was telling him to go back, but he wanted to capture more on camera first. As he continued to make his way towards the stream, he tripped on a root hidden by the fog. Cliff found himself face to face with a withered, anorexic corpse. Cliff flailed and screamed. As he got up, though, the corpse was gone. Cliff was rattled as he hurriedly walked from the spot he had tripped. The path began to open considerably. In a few seconds he was upon the stream, as well as the most frightening sight of his life. Just feet away from him, at the bank of the stream, sat a man. He didn't seem to notice Cliff. The man was terribly pale and emaciated. He was balding, with just a few strands of hair on his scalp. Cliff trained his camcorder on him for a few seconds before backing away. As he backed away, the man whirled around. The man's face was as emaciated as the rest of his body, with two sunken black orbs for eyes. Cliff froze, paralyzed with fear as the man stood up. For several tense seconds the man eyed him intently. Then he took a step toward Cliff. And another, and another. Cliff's mind screamed at him to run, but he was frozen in place, unable to move. Without warning, the man cried out and lunged at Cliff. Reacting instinctively, Cliff raised his arms to defend himself. He caught both of the man's arms. "Please help. My daughter's missing. You have to help me. Make it stop," the man wailed. Utterly terrified, Cliff pushed with all his might, sending the ghostly man tumbling onto his back. The man cried out as he landed. Finally finding his leg muscles, Cliff sprinted back the way he came, expecting the man to chase him. The man didn't seem to follow, but Cliff nonetheless sprinted, determined to escape this nightmare of a place and never come back. Cliff was frightfully aware that the whispers were becoming louder and more agitated. To his fear, he realized the fog was rising, and with it the voices were rising. The fog was almost up to his waist now. Cliff had no choice but to press on, making his way back to the van as quickly as possible. Cliff stopped. In his path was another ghostly figure. This one paid no attention to him, passing right by him. It was still more than enough to send a shiver down his spine. The fog was rising rapidly. It was up to his chest now. The whispers were becoming stronger as he began to run back to his van more desperately than before. As Cliff continued running, he stopped to catch his breath. Almost instantly, the voices were louder and clearer than ever. As the voices assaulted him, the black hazy figure from before appeared in front of him. Cliff could see it much more clearly this time. The figure was about 7 feet tall and all black with the exception of its glowing red eyes. "WH, what are you? What do you want?" Cliff stammered. After eyeing him silently for a few seconds, the being spoke in a deep, thunderous voice. "I am the mother of the bog. I want you to join me, my child. Feed me and join the rest of my children." The being boomed. "No," Cliff shouted. The being extended an arm towards him, causing Cliff to run. This had to be a hallucination from the fog, Cliff thought. In a few seconds he realized it wasn't. The being was nowhere to be seen, but Cliff had run away and had gotten himself spun around. As he looked around to get his bearings, he saw multiple figures. They were all around him, circling him. They were walking slowly, like a shark circling its prey in the ocean. He shined his light on them, revealing dozens, if not hundreds of them. They all looked alike, their faces ashen, and their eyes sunken, emaciated with pale, waxy skin showing nearly every bone. Cliff screamed and broke into a run. The beings shrieked in unison, shattering Cliff's ears as he ran, the beings hot on his tail. Worse, the fog was nearly nose level now. As Cliff ran, he inadvertently inhaled some of the fog. "Stay here. Don't be afraid. This is where you belong," said a voice in Cliff's head. "No." Cliff shouted as the thought left his head. He could hear the mob of beings chasing him. He didn't dare look back. The fog was still rising. He had to get out before the fog claimed and made him want to stay. He had to climb a tree. It was the only way. Hopefully he could wait it out until daylight, and hopefully these fuckers can't climb, Cliff thought to himself. Cliff began climbing the first tree he could reach. He went up one branch, then another, then another. Suddenly, he felt a vice-like grip grab his ankle. One of them had gotten him. Cliff almost fell into the horde of monsters, but was able to wrap both arms around a strong branch. He cried in pain as nails from the hand dug into his skin, drawing blood. The fog was still rising. Cliff had no idea what time it was. He had to hope these things would vanish when the sun came up. If he could last that long. Cliff looked down. The things had swarmed the tree. They were staring up at him ravenously. If he lost his grip, he was a goner for sure. The fog was almost at Cliff's nose again. Cliff held his breath. The fog would drive him insane. He couldn't breathe in it. A minute passed. Cliff took a breath. He had to. His mind was immediately flooded. Don't fight it, Cliff. This is your home. This is where you belong. The voice said, No, my home is in Arkansas. Cliff screamed. I am your mother, Cliff. I love all my children. Stay with me and accept my love. The voice boomed. The voice was reassuring. He started to loosen his grip, only to immediately come to his senses and tighten his grip. You're not my mother, Cliff shouted. He had to fight the urges. He couldn't give in. He had to hold on until sunrise. He held on for dear life. He could see the sun peeking over the horizon. This place didn't seem so bad. Surely there were reasons to accept this family, Cliff thought to himself. No, snap out of it. The fog is getting to you. Just hold on a little longer, Cliff told himself. But the mother is so welcoming, Cliff thought. He had nothing but a lonely life back in Arkansas. He should join his new family. Yes, yes, this is my home. Cliff said to himself. He let go. He immediately screamed as he realized what he had done. However, Cliff didn't fall into the hands of a pack of demons. He fell onto the ground with a thud. The sun had risen enough to dry the things away. He laid there, sighing in relief. As he laid there, relieved, something wasn't right. To his horror, Cliff realized a cloud had covered the sun. Cliff broke into a sprint as the beings reappeared, chasing him. He tore through the brush and wilderness with vigor. He could see the clearing. He was almost at the van. Cliff felt a hand brush against his back, but it didn't succeed in grabbing him. Cliff burst through the tree line. He tripped, but to his shock, the beings didn't follow. He looked. They stood behind the trees, staring at him with angry snarls. It occurred to Cliff that they most likely couldn't leave the bog. Not wasting any time, Cliff got into his van and drove back into town. Needless to say, this was the last expedition Cliff ever undertook. He showed the footage to Everett, who called him a complete fool. Cliff posted his footage online, but it was ultimately dismissed as a hoax by many, much to his chagrin. Cliff just hoped his investigation wouldn't inspire other people to seek out the bog. Story 3, The Darkness. This is a story from my childhood, one which I have not told anyone except for my wife. Just thinking about it still sends shivers down my spine. I grew up in a small house with just my mother. It was a nice little house with 2 bedrooms upstairs, a small living room and kitchen on the main floor, and a basement where I kept all of my toys. The basement had a small storage room in the back, lit by a single light bulb. It wasn't until I was 7 years old that I started to get scared to go down there. It was a dark, rainy night as I played with my Legos in the basement. Rainwater slowly dripped through the window and down the cement wall. It was cold down there that night, more so than usual. I was wrapped up in my hoodie and a blanket as I played. While attempting to build an airplane out of my Legos, I suddenly got a chill down my spine, followed by the overwhelming feeling of being watched. I turned and looked behind me toward the dark storage room. Something drew my attention to the room, but I couldn't see what it was. It seemed darker than usual. I didn't think a room could get that dark, especially with the lights on in the room adjacent to it. It almost seemed like there was something in there drawing away all of the light, sucking it in like a black hole. I stared into the darkness at seemingly nothing until I saw something move. I didn't know what it was, but it seemed even darker than the room. I saw it for just a second before it disappeared. As it did, I could see light slowly start to trickle into the room. This terrified me, so I ran upstairs to the living room to seek comfort from my mother. When I told her what I had seen, she just told me that it was my mind playing tricks on me because of the heavy rain outside. I went to bed that night not thinking much about what had happened in the basement. I lay back in my bed and closed my eyes just like on any other night, and I fell asleep rather quickly. Although I fell asleep like it was a normal night, the night was less than normal. I woke up that night with the feeling of being watched. I opened my eyes to see nothing but darkness. I couldn't even see the light from the street light outside of my window. Thinking that maybe my blinds were closed, I looked across my room for the soft green glow of my alarm clock, but it wasn't there. At that moment, I realized that this was a lot like the darkness I had seen in the basement, and that scared me. My fear doubled in an instant when I thought I saw movement in the darkness. In my terror from seeing that there was something in my room, I pulled my blankets over my head and screamed. In the midst of my screams, I heard my door open and the soft call from my mother. As she sat down on my bed, I slowly pulled my blankets off from over my head and looked around my room. The light had returned to my room, and I could now see the soft glow of my clock blinking at 2:17 a.m. and the light from the street light outside my window, with my blinds fully open. My mother asked me what was wrong, and I told her what had happened. Reassuringly, she told me that it was just a nightmare and to go back to sleep. She gently kissed my forehead and left my room, closing the door behind her. It was hard for me to fall asleep after that, so I just watched my clock slowly tick away the minutes. This went on for about 2 or 3 months, staying at this level of activity. Nothing more than the feeling of being watched in the darkness. However, that all changed on Halloween night. It was a typical Ontario Halloween night, cold, windy, and rainy. I had returned home at night from trick-or-treating with my mom at about 8 o'clock and went down to the basement to play with my toys for a bit. Before bed, I could hear the rain tap against the basement window, and the wind whistling as it blew between my house and my neighbor's house. Something was unsettling in the basement at night, more so than usual. As I played, I thought I heard sounds coming from the storage room, but every time I looked there was nothing. This was nothing strange to me, as it's been happening for the last few months. So I continued to play. I played for about 10 minutes when the power suddenly went out, and that's when everything changed. As soon as the power went out, I heard more movement from the storage room behind me. I immediately looked behind me to see a quick flash of red light, and then darkness. As I stared, I could hear footsteps from the dark room, but I could see nothing. The footsteps slowly made their way toward me, the darkness somehow getting darker as they approached, until they suddenly stopped. I moved my eyes around the room, careful not to move any other part of my body in fear that whatever this was would see me. I looked around the room, trying to see what this thing was, but I could see nothing. It was so dark I couldn't even see my feet. I wanted to run upstairs to the safety of my mother, but I was frozen in fear, so I didn't move a muscle or even breathe. I sat in silence, listening for whatever was in the room with me. I couldn't hear a sound, not even the rain on the window or the wind between the houses. As I listened, the hair on my arms and the back of my neck stood up on edge, and I got chills down my spine, and that's when I heard it. A deep voice whispered into my right ear, "You will be mine, Robert." I instantly screamed and ran to the stairs, tripping on toes along the way. I made my way up the stairs and through the door to the living room, slamming the door behind me. I ran to my mother, crying, and she held me, not knowing what was going on. I told her what had happened, but she just told me that my mind was just playing tricks on me again. What I had heard was just the wind, but my mind exaggerated it because of the darkness. From that moment in the basement, no matter what my mother said, I knew that whatever this thing was, it was real. From then on, I refused to go into the basement alone. In fact, I didn't like going into the basement at all. The activity in the basement itself settled down a little bit because I was never alone down there after that incident. But I still had trouble sleeping. I would wake up at night with the feeling of being watched, to see nothing in my room but darkness. I would lay there staring into the darkness with my blankets pulled up to my neck, hoping there was nothing there. But after a few minutes I would hear that same voice again, "You're mine, Robert." The second I would hear that voice, I would pull my blankets over my head and scream, causing my mother to run into my room, and every time she would say it was just a bad dream. This sequence would go on at least twice per week until August of 1998, when the activity escalated yet again. My mother had been dating her now husband for a while now, and we were preparing to move into his house. I was going to be on vacation for 2 weeks in Quebec with my grandparents, as my mom moved our things into the new house. But what happened my last night in that house still terrifies me to this day. I had fallen asleep easily that night, excited to be leaving on vacation the next morning. But the rest of the night would not be so easy. I woke up again that night, this time to the sound of breathing. I opened my eyes to see nothing but darkness yet again. Thinking that my mother was in my room with me, I called out to her, "Mom." But what answered was definitely not my mother. It was that deep voice yet again. "Your mother is not here. She can't help you, Robert. You're finally mine." I continued to stare into the darkness, thinking that it was my imagination. But as my eyes adjusted to the darkness, I could see the silhouette of that dark figure standing at the end of my bed. I immediately pulled my blankets over my head and screamed, but my mother didn't come. I felt pressure on the end of my bed, as if someone was sitting on it. I screamed again. Suddenly, I felt something grab onto my ankle under the blankets and pull. I somehow managed to turn onto my stomach and grab the end of my mattress, but it only gave me a few seconds before it shifted, and I was pulled right out of my bed. I continued to scream, louder than I had ever screamed before. Finally, I could hear my mother get out of bed and make her way to the door. Only this time, when she reached it, the door did not open. The entity continued to drag me toward the door as I continued to scream. I could hear my mother pushing against the door, trying to get it open without success. As it dragged me across the carpet, I tried to grab onto anything that I could, but the only thing that seemed to work was the foot of my bed. I stopped as I took hold, and I finally stopped moving toward the door. I could feel the entity begin to pull harder, hard enough to lift my body off of the carpet, but I managed to hold on. As I fought the entity, I could hear my mother struggle with the door. It took my mother a good 2 or 3 minutes to finally get the door open. As the door finally opened, light returned to my room, and I no longer felt the grip on my ankles, and I fell back to the carpet. I looked around the room, terrified. My room was a disaster. The sheets were in a ball on the floor. My mattress was half off of my bed frame, and my bed was no longer sitting flush with the wall, but pulled off about 3 feet. I looked around for the entity, but it was no longer there. My mother held me tight as I cried on the floor, not knowing what happened, only thinking that it was a really intense nightmare. I spent the rest of that night in my mother's bed, but did not sleep. The next morning, I could see the rug burn on my arms and elbows from being dragged across the carpet. I looked at my ankles to see they were red and swollen, but harder to see were the little scratches along the top of my feet. That was my last night in that house, and I'm glad that it was. To this day, I do not know what this thing was or what it wanted of me, but thinking of it still scares me. In my adolescent years, and even now that I'm in my mid-20s, I have what my doctor has only described as night terrors. I wake up in the middle of the night to see nothing but darkness, and as I stare into the darkness I see a figure, even darker than the darkness around it. I still scream when I see the silhouette, the darkness. Now that I'm older, though, I have more control over my actions. I take a flashlight and shine it through my room, or I'll turn on the light switch. Many times I'll just wake up screaming, sometimes even running out of my room with no idea why. I do not know if what I see is the same entity that stalked me as a child, or if it's just my imagination digging deep into my subconscious. But the entity still haunts me to this day. I just pray that whatever this is does not start going after my wife or our future kids. Story 4. Distorted Warning Signals. When I got the first one, I was literally seconds away from stepping onto the plane when a call from unknown blared from my cell phone. It was a ringtone I hadn't heard before, one I was pretty sure hadn't come with the phone. Normally, I wouldn't have stopped to answer it, but I was expecting a call about a job I had interviewed for the previous week. I took a deep breath in and accepted the call. "Hello, do not get on the plane." A woman's voice, garbled and strange, as if her vocal cords had been shredded, and she was trying desperately to choke out speech. Despite the unnerving, fractured quality of her voice, her tone was insistent and eerily calm. Then the call ended. I froze. I had always had a slight phobia of air travel, and something about this call just. There's no way I was about to get on a 7-hour flight now. I turned around and headed toward the food court. I'd just get another flight later in the afternoon, I figured. I watched from the airport Starbucks 3 hours later as every TV in the terminal lit up with the crash footage of the plane I should have been on. No survivors, not a single one. I tried to trace the call, so did the police. But there was nothing to trace. There was no evidence my phone had ever received a call around that time. They analyzed phone records, incoming and outgoing communication to my phone. Nothing. I wasn't making it up. I couldn't have been. That wasn't the only call. Throughout the years, they were few and far between, but always right, and I always listened. Do not go on that blind date tonight. 5 months later, my would-be date was convicted of killing for women, all with my hair color and build. Found them in a shallow grave about 250 feet from the diner he offered to take me to. Do not drive to the concert tonight. A teen-wheeler lost control and plowed into a line of cars. Every driver crushed, every driver killed, in the stretch of freeway I would have been driving down. No matter if I got a new phone, if I moved across the country, the calls would still come. I could almost feel the presence of whatever it was, whatever it is, watching over me. I imagined being at the bottom of the freezing ocean, still strapped into my coach section plane seat, or being in that mass grave across from the diner, or watching an 18-wheeler skidding toward my car, knowing death was imminent, and I'd get this tightness in my chest. I'd think about how thin that line was, how close I'd gotten. If I hadn't had a job interview I was waiting to hear back from, I'd have never listened to that first call, and that would be it for me. It always felt like something was coming for me, but there was always this fractured, warped voice, with these calls that never seemed to exist after I heard them. Self-destructing warning signals, rotting away before my eyes, and I was alive. I had a bad feeling about this cruise. I had planned it as a girls' week out with some of my old friends from college, and was looking forward to a week in the tropics in the dead of winter. But part of me could almost sense that the call was coming. Maybe I'd watched Titanic one too many times, but there was a little nagging fear from the start. I hoped it would be fine, but I knew that if something was going to happen, I'd get the call, I'd know. Now, a week before I'm set to go on the cruise, after stepping into my apartment, after returning from dinner with a friend, I notice my cell has a message from unknown. They've never had to leave a message before. Haven't checked it all night. Damn it. And I had really wanted to go on that cruise too. Well, not worth whatever horrific fate awaited me in that cold, dark ocean. I click play message, and feel my stomach drop as I listen to the voice, sounding horrifically distorted, as if it emanates from a throat slashed to ribbons, crackling with more urgency than ever before. I look around my apartment as the voice on the phone repeats the same phrase over and over again. Do not come home after dinner tonight. Do not come home after dinner tonight. Do not come home after dinner tonight.